Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello all, welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist here with you, and I want to remind everyone that this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes. This does not constitute working with a mental health professional. Please seek out a mental health professional in your area, and if they're not in your immediate area, please consider the abilities to see them virtually. I know it's not all what everyone would like, but that still gives you a chance to get some mental health, which is better than no mental health. So today we're going to be talking with a gentleman that was introduced to me. And after listening to some of his talk, I found some kindredness in it as well. And that I think work that, especially as a Black man, we need to be considering and thinking about, because there's healing in what we're going to be talking about in the work that they do, and healing that I think also culturally we need to revisit and understand differently. So today's guest is Aaron Johnson. Aaron Johnson is a facilitator, public speaker, and a touch activist who practices closeness as a way to break down barriers between people. As a co-founder of both Holistic Resistance and Grief to Action, Aaron takes the time to hold the stories of Black people around homophobia, transphobia, internalized racism, and those that are chronically undertouched. Aaron has created the Chronically Under Touched project, the basic strategy to bring a Black body from being chronically undertouched to a state of touch balance as a part of the lifelong journey of interrupting oppressive systems that make touch balance a radical action. So welcome to Untying Knots, Aaron.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to talk to you today.
Thank you for being here, because I think this is a very critical element to our sense of being, but even then to what some would consider self-care. And we're not talking about the self-care that you find yourself, buying up or anything like that. This is about the long-term sense of how are we in touch, not just with ourselves, but with those around us.
Yes.
So how did you get here?
Yeah, how did I get here? On paper, it started about 11 years ago. Mm-hmm. It didn't have the form of the language we're using now, like Chronically Under Touched, but the death of my father in 2010, I didn't even take the time or even have the capacity to have access to my tears till 2 years after he passed away. And in that journey of healing and access to my tears, I realized how much I wasn't in my body. And I could almost distill it down to a moment where at the time she was my fiance, but before I got married, Camelia and I were talking about my father's death, and I was explaining to him what happened, and she started to weep. And after she finished weeping, she looked at me and goes, "Why aren't you feeling this? Have you cried? Have you felt this before?" And I said, "No, not really." She said, "You should look at that." And that was the kind of first step into me going back into my body, going, something's up. And that journey of accessing my tears then moved itself into me examining my touch needs. And so I worked for 2 years on my own personally to get to a place of noticing how chronically undertouched I was. I didn't have that language. That language didn't show up till another 2 years after that, working with the mentee. And that story with him and that moment where I asked him the question, when was the last time he had been held platonically and thoughtfully for 3 minutes, and he couldn't think of 3 minutes in the last 12 years. And that was the moment that conversation was pivotal to birth the language Chronically Undertouched. And here we are almost 7.5 years later, and I have much more language and practice and community around it. And it's still an emergent practice. That's how I arrived.
Very nice. And very telling too, because we're dealing with the classic image, not only that many men find, and I'm just talking about in any culture here, about the idea that the man is supposed to be stoic, unemotional, if at all possible. If they are to show emotions, it's either happiness or sadness, not sadness, anger. But even then, the nature of what touch conveys, because there's so much that is conveyed just in that gesture.
Yeah.
That sometimes even words just cannot provide.
Mm-hmm.
And the nature, especially for us as Black men, of what does touch mean for us? What does touch, how is that actually something that has shaped where we are sitting right now? Both what touch we have been able to access and what touch we haven't.
Yes. Mm.
So,
Well said.
why don't you begin to start framing for some of us the language that you now understand and work with to give people more context?
Totally. I think what's important is there's a couple of things that I will say in context of the chronically under touched. Is I tried other words like I'm under touched. No, it's chronic. When we look at the amount of touch the human body actually needs and how much is readily available to us, and then we add in intersectionalities of oppression, and I look at the kind of birthing of the Black brute. It really, to me, chronically just articulates that there's probably a spectrum, but most folks I work with are somewhere on the extreme, meaning they haven't gotten 3 minutes of thoughtful touch in the last month, and let alone 12 months. And so that's common. That's pretty common. And so for me, the language chronically under touch just speaks to the seriousness of it, and it slows us down a bit. The other piece I think is important is we do a lot of juxtapositions, right? For me as an African heritage man, I go, where does tender touch fit in my world? Like where in my daily life, when I turn on the television, when I go to the store, when I interact with people, when I listen to music, where does the idea of tender touch and my Black male cis body come together? And that to me, I find is rare. It's rare. I mean, I've looked a lot of places, and it's rare that that's commonly available once I get past the age of like 5 or 6 and 7. And by the time I get to 18, it's not even a landscape. And so I look at that by design of American, by design of oppression. So chronically under touch is one of the key things we use. And another thing I use in our workshops, we oftentimes use this idea of, it's this common phrase, we say, let's slow that down. And we don't mean by just say it slower. We're talking about taking the time to observe our realities in a much more clear, and sometimes when we get to these vulnerable places, we want to skip past them very quickly. I don't know how many times we get to that part of the story, and it's a part of the story. I remember the first time I cried, I had someone hold space for me. This is why slowing down became part of my own practice. So amazing space holder. Her name was Jennifer Ramos, amazing human being. And she had me tell my story of my father's death. And I could tell that story with no emotion until I get to the place where I tell my mother in the story, I tell my mother that her husband is dead, that our father is dead. The moment I tell her that, and my mom begins to weep and scream like one should do when one loses their loved one for their lifetime, a lifetime. I have a hard time when I tell that story not to have emotions. So I would tell her this story almost numbly up until that point. And she had me tell a story one time. It's a year and a half into our holding space for me. And I get to that part of the story, and I barely make it through without tears. I was hanging on for a thread. And she leans forward and goes, you tell me that story one more time, and just the part where you told your mother. She leaned in and listened. And I just started to begin to weep. And I think that is a slowdown. She heard me tell the story probably 10 times over the last 2 years. She's worked with it multiple times. But she said, I just want you to tell me that part of the story where you told your mother that your father had passed. That part. And that's slowing down. It's just taking us back to that space emotionally, physically, time-wise. And it cracked me open, but it's also a place of how much I want to skip past. I even got faster in my language when I got to that part of the story. I got a little more, I want to get past that space, because the mere time being there in that space was never safe for me. And it was safe for me for those 2 years, but I didn't believe it for a year and a half. And so I say that because I look at slowing that down. That's almost the fundamental practice we do outside of listening. And so for me, that's one of the things that I think that you'll see show up a lot in our deep dives, in our workshops, and our one-on-ones, is we'll practice constantly. How do we slow that down?
Because what you're so talking about with this aspect of the vulnerability and the trying to escape from that part is a critical part too of what we deal with. Just the notion that this is a place where you could be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And at that same time, what makes me think about comes back to one of the most critical things that we probably are taught, and is that no place is vulnerable for us to do that.
Yeah.
And even more so when we are with our own people within our own homes and so forth, that somehow those places that we are supposed to be able to be vulnerable are also the places we are basically getting judged as not to allow that vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
As you're telling it, I was thinking about one of my clients who, long and short of it, his mother basically said that he was less of a man as a child growing up, that he had to go into the military to theoretically prove her wrong.
Mm.
And just that sense of, this is a place where the touch and that vulnerability should be the most allowed compared to everything else we're seeing in the world.
Yeah. Mm. Well said. I think tenderness, I was saying tenderness is such a human thing. It's such a real human thing. As I appreciate that piece of where that's oftentimes one of the first things distracted from the young male body, and particularly the young Black male body.
And then throw into how that becomes more difficult to find that place of vulnerability in other places of the world, especially when it has failed in the family.
Yeah.
And your experience there became the place that this was an environment where someone was intentionally trying to make this not just a place of safety, but because that's all going to be just relative to what you can think is safe, but that there is a space of normalizing that it was okay for your tears, that it was okay for you to have that experience.
Yes.
And valuing that experience is actually normal and human.
Yes.
Versus the idea of the stoic.
Yes. There's something like moving through my body right now as that you share that feels so resonant with, if I had to have a mantra that I have to almost say every day to folks that I'm mentoring in our workshops and our one-on-ones and our, drop-ins, is that's a normal human experience. Yeah, those tears are a normal human experience. That desire for a tender touch in your back right now is a normal human experience. And it's amazing how effective oppression has turned normal human experiences into a weapon. And things that are really inhumane, like punching each other in the face as hard as we can until someone goes unconscious, is like, yeah, that's normal. Yeah, that's just good. It's good for the brain to get punched. No, I mean, it's just not. And I say that not lightly, but it feels important to slow down the normalness of inhumane activity. And who pays the price for it. And we look at all of the therapists and all the mental health support, and I look at what we're doing as a culture, and I'm like, there's not enough therapists to hold the level of isolation around. And touch is that, like I always say, is that canary in the emotional mind. Like, if touch is not there, there's a whole breadth of other things that are going to be impacted by the nervous system. So I just track like the knowing of, when we talk about a comprehensive touch plan for young Black men, we talk about go outside and put your feet on the ground. Like, well, I understand why that's important. I mean, just let's go outside and put your feet on the ground, your actual bare feet on the ground. And I'm right now in a little cabin. It's a cob house. It's made out of 80% earth and timber. And it's so different to live or sleep in a house that's made of like 80% earth. It's palpably different. And so I know everyone doesn't have access to that, but I just want to name how important and how interwoven we are with the planet. But oftentimes the Chronically Under Touched, we're already separate. We're separate from the land. And there's all kind of other barriers that separate Black folks, particularly from the land. But there's all that levels of like, land reparations and Chronically Under Touched are linked. Yes, they are. Having access and safety, going to national parks, and Black folks being have access to that piece, they're connected. They all kind of normalize why a basketball court, which basketball is a great sport, is way more accessible to most folks in the inner city than the Redwood Forest. That's by design in a lot of ways. So yeah, I'm just feeling that in my body deep.
Certainly. Because I think it's also clear for people to understand when we're talking about touch, we're not talking, and as you pointed out, the aspect of we're not talking about beating somebody up. We're not talking about it from a place of sexual not, I don't want to say empowerment. I want to say sexual mismanagement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or getting into a power dynamic where touch is basically being used to overpower somebody.
Yes.
This is a place where consent is being recognized and embraced. But touch, as you just pointed out with the aspect of go ahead and touch the ground, is not just about human to human. It's also human to nature, to the world.
Yeah. Yes. Ooh. There's a piece around consent that you said that just activates a lot of my work that I do with young Black men, specifically because of how easily words of accusation of consent violation sticks to our Black bodies so easily in the culture we live in. And I really track the relationship between the chronically undertouched Black body and the consent violations that I oftentimes is mediating for. And I find that when one is in their touch balance, their ability to hear the guidelines and best thinking around consent are so much more accessible than somebody that is in a chronic untouched state and they're in a trauma-led state and they're trying to do the consent thing and they're having a hard time not justifying this behavior, but having a hard time because no one is actually addressing the root issue, which is listening, yes. But I always tell people if I've been starving, lost in the forest for weeks on end, I'm starving. You take me into a buffet and it smells like my favorite steaks and all the things that I love. And I'm like, oh, I've been starving for chunking. Oh, and there's some guidelines. There's some guidelines for this steak that you have and all this buffet, this whole buffet that's here. The guideline is you get to smell it for an hour. Don't even reach and touch and grab a biscuit. Don't grab you a steak. Just smell. I know you've been starving for 4 weeks in the forest, but the guidelines here, the consent level here is you get to eat in an hour. So I just want you to walk by and just smell it. And just smell it. In the meantime, there are other people walking by you, grabbing the steak, biting it, eating the buffet, and they're like, this is so good. And you're like, I've been starving. I want some. And you finally say, okay, 30 minutes, I'm going to grab some real fast. And I'm going to grab it. I'm going to sneak it. I'm going to sneak it. They're like, it's outside the consent. What is wrong with you? It lasted for 30 minutes. And it doesn't justify the behavior. He should still wait. But if we said, you know what? We're going to nourish you for those 4 weeks. We're gonna bring you out of your nourishment. We're going to feed you in increments because you've been starving for 4 weeks. We're going to feed you in IVs and water hydration and slowly bring you back to nourishment. We're going to bring in increments. You're not going to smell any food. We're going to be thoughtful about your environment. We're going to bring you back to complete balance where you're nourished. I mean, your blood tests say that you have all the nutrients you need. I'm going to take you back to that buffet that smells amazing where everyone else is eating. I'm going to say, can you stand there for an hour? You'll no problem. I got a problem at all. I can sit here for an hour. Not even an issue. People are like, do you want some of this? It's so good. Not even tempted. I'm at touch balance. So whatever guidelines are given, they don't influence. That makes sense to me. I can't do that thing. Right. So there's a way that the chronic untouched narrative is, to me, foundationally in complete support of the Me Too movement, of the chronic untouched bodies that are going out breaking consent. It's in complete support of that. And so oftentimes we find that we spend a lot of time, and we should hold people accountable for their actions. We spend a lot of time saying you are now in trouble. You are now kicked out of community. You are now, because we have no actual plan of like, what is your touch plan? Where are you at in your actual needs? And what does it mean if we can get you to a place, or even better yet, get ahead of it so you are in that place of violation? So I look at, fusion dance communities. I look at blues dance communities. I look at yoga studios. I look at corporate business, and I just see it riddled with the opportunity we can get ahead of this, and we oftentimes don't. So I just want to name that consent piece is a massive piece of my heart as I'm working with a lot of folks throughout the Northwest and the United States to think about incorporating that wisdom into their consent practices and training. There's a lot of good things around consent. There's a way in which I think that's oftentimes missed or yet dismissed in a way that I think is underserving the population we want to serve the most.
Very much so. Because I know also when I'm working with clients and so on, especially men, one of the things that sort of gets caught up, and this even comes up with some degrees about what we're seeing with people who are having the issue with, say, porn addiction. is the aspect of what has been normalized around the idea of touch and vulnerability. That the most allowable time for a man to have that touch and to have that vulnerability is also intertwined with sex.
Yeah.
And as opposed to having this moment of, touching the ground, enjoying the feel of the water in the swimming pool.
Yeah.
Having that hand on the back, having that hug, which makes for that standpoint of that the quote unquote craving for sex is actually the craving for vulnerability. But it gets mislabeled.
Ooh. That quote unquote craving for sex is craving for vulnerability, craving to be seen. That's well said.
And craving to be touched.
And craving to be touched.
Which is where it's very easy for it to flip over into that inappropriate, that destructive, that power seeking, which is often one of the things that I know is talked about with the idea of sexual assault. It's not actually about the sex, it's about the power. It's about, and that vulnerability has become replaced by that drive for power.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really important piece, particularly around porn and parts of mainstream music culture. I, as I track trauma through these music experiences, I track trauma through pornography. I always tell the young men that I work with around pornography, I say, I'm just curious if you could find me a video where a Black man has a sexual experience, and when he's done or even during, he begins to weep, and whoever he's having sex with just turns around and cuddles him and holds him thoughtfully until he gets to a place of balance and turns back around and goes back into a sensual space. I see any version of that where there's some tears involved and sex combined. I just want to find, and they can't find a video. They can't find a video on mainstream porn sites or anywhere else where tenderness, vulnerability actually shows up for Black men that mimics them. It happens every day. I guarantee you, as we're talking right now, there's some Black man somewhere in the United States that has tender tears and has an orgasm within 5 minutes of those tender tears. That's happening on a regular basis, but it's ungoogleable, it's unfindable, it's unshapeable to share that we can actually be human. And I remember when I heard an interview, I think it was Mike Tyson, and it stuck with me. I said it was a lot because he said, I used to cry before every fight. And then I remember the interview was like, why do you cry before every fight? He said, because I hated the person that I was becoming to go out and fight. And I thought to myself, I saw hundreds of minutes of thousands of minutes of Mike Tyson, and I saw 1 minute of him crying before a fight. I don't have, maybe it exists. I'm sure someone had something, but it didn't exist. Why? Why wasn't it? Because we don't want to see Iron Mike crying, being human. We only want to see him oiled up, knocking somebody out or being knocked out. That's all we want to see. And I think porn industry, Hollywood, distills the Black male body, distills Blackness down to these tropes. Now we're getting better cinematic. I love the influx of Black cinema that's profound, but it is still in its beginning early stages. That's when I encourage us, and this language we're using now, this thoughtful now, I want to be proven wrong. I want to talk to you a year from now and go, oh, this is Googleable. These images are all accessible. These stories are accessible, but they're not at this moment. And it's by design, and it have been for the last 50 years. So for me, or 100 years for that matter. But for me, I feel like we're on the cusp. We're on the cusp, I feel, maybe I'm optimistic here, of really having an opportunity to have different conversations around sexuality, around Black male bodies, around tenderness, around being fully human in our stories, in our erotic material, right? In our stories around erotic material. And I think my work around Chronically Under Touched, it feels like a kink in this culture because this culture is so confused about Black male bodies being fully human.
Very so. Very true. Very true. And as you were talking about it, what suddenly flipped back into my mind, which also gets into the aspect of how as two Black males interact, was the scene from the first Black Panther movie after Zuri is killed and T'Challa is broken up crying and so forth. Killmonger is taunting him saying, "This is your king," that he could start weeping at the death of this person, as opposed to Killmonger staying there stoic, willing to perpetuate more violence.
Yeah.
And let's be frank. Yes, there is a protection of the people, but there is also the recognition and acknowledgement of the loss of the people. Yes. And the moment that T'Challa shows this, again, human quality, and the quality that was denied Killmonger's character as a
Yes.
child
Yes.
is what brought us part of what brought us Killmonger.
Yes.
It's part of what set the difference between, shall we say, to a degree, of what made Wakanda that desired place.
Yes. 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 Oh. I just feel in my body because that film was profound in this impact on the Black community. And you're naming these tropes that are just under-tracked.
Mm-hmm.
There's not near enough analysis of what's being said. It's a little bit of dismissiveness of what you just shared.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, God forbid you said what you said right now the day after that film released. It would be like, how dare you have any kind of analysis that's outside of like, this is amazing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of what's happening. It's not that it wasn't an amazing, important
Very
film.
much so.
It's an important film, but let's have an analysis.
Sorry, I had a glitch there for a second, so could you repeat that last part?
Yeah, I just saying that when you look at the film, if we would have said that the day after that film came out, it would have been like, how dare you have an analysis of that film that's not just, it was amazing. It was important for all of us to see and to be made in the celebration of Blackness. But let's track these trauma stories that are being retold again and again. What might it mean to slip in some humanness in the Black male body with all the muscles and oil and cinematography? What about a more complete emotional profile? What about that?
Or even Killmonger destroying the heart-shaped herb in the standpoint of he expects to be the last king of Wakanda.
Yes.
And there's someone else going to be coming after him.
Yeah.
And yet the people think of who is coming next.
Yeah.
Who is in that cycle of being here. And that also translates into what is communicated by our sense of touch.
Yes. Yes. Oh. I feel like I almost need a whole like Black Panther analysis. Cause I feel like to me, I know we can go to spiritual. I'll pause. I'll just say this one thing. I know we have meetings to talk about, but I just say that in the context of real quickly here, I'll just say that it's really tough for the end of that first film that two Black men were trying to kill each other for the last sequence of the entire sequence, and that in the end one was dying and one was living. That was the ultimate outcome of two Black men fighting to the death at the very end of that powerful story. And I'm like, could we have a different image? Could we have a different image? And could we have a more analysis of what that meant at the end of the day is that Black folks are fighting Black folks? That's really important to track when it comes to like, where Hollywood's like, yeah, that makes sense in the script. Let's make sure that's fun. And the Black all the people that could support the thinking right now that was one of the stories. That's why I think Black Panther 2 sits in my body so much differently. But that being said, I appreciate the emotional analysis we're giving. I think that needs to happen for more amazing stories. Make them, but we should have conversations about them that are this emotionally aware. That's all.
And the same thing can be said for Wakanda 2, or Wakanda Forever. Now we have black and brown people fighting over each other, and the battlefront that comes at the end of that between Shuri and Namor is also that place. And then the moment of how does Shuri get back in touch with those qualities of her when, of course, Ramonda's message to her that she is more than just the anger.
Yes.
Or the vengeance.
Ooh.
And I would point out that is also the moment where she is physically also in contact with Namor.
Yes.
Admittedly, it's her foot that's on him, but still, she's making some sort of contact with him too. Yeah. And she's making contact with the earth because their other foot was would have been behind her. So that bridge.
Yes. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's also across both Panther films is Black people in nature in ways that we don't typically see. In a Hollywood, not outside of a National Geographic kind of, white voice talking over, but like empowered in ownership Black bodies on the earth. But there's a level of, I would love to kind of slow down how that lands in Black people's bodies today too. And I will say too that I would love to see writers and directors and producers and casting directors cast that film phenomenally in a lot of ways. But I think there's a way in which I would love for that whole ecosystem to have a deep analysis of the Chronically Under Touched narrative and how they can shift what young Black folks are doing to each other and around each other with one profound cinematic movie, and how interruptive it'll feel when we have those kind of analysis incorporate in the amazing storytelling cinematography that's already being expressed. That's one name like, ooh, Imagine if this narrative we're talking about right now is actually cinematically available, how that could just shift in one generation. Folks are like, oh yeah, of course we can cuddle and hug and then also be strong and able and cry and also not be mocked and we still could be rulers and leaders and whatever we need to be and be a complete emotional profile like that.
Which in many ways also what we saw in Wakanda Forever is that the women had much more allowance for that.
Yes.
And I know I'm behind because I still need to see Woman King. I was busy with a lot of stuff at the time it came out. I'm certain that there's that element there too. That it was much easier for, even though they were warriors, there was still a certain level of bonding that could happen between them that did involve touch.
Yeah, I love Viola Davis, and I saw that movie in theaters as soon as it came out. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about it, but I will say that you're right. It's palpable when you have Black women leading a cinematic film. It's amazing of how much emotional intelligence is almost organically in the script in the movie, even though that kind of filtered through white Hollywood. Still, it's amazing how much still makes it to the screen. In the contrary, so I think Woman King is so many places in there that had opportunities for tenderness and vulnerability that you just wouldn't see cinematically. And if it was a Man King, he'll call it version of it. So yeah, 100%. It's a film that I honor all these films. I'm not hardcore boycotting any Black cinema film anytime soon, since we need a lot more in my book before I get really critical. But I think we should have analysis and have an investment and having this discussion and back them at the same time. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Which then brings, I think, also nicely wraps back into the aspect of one of our biggest elements here is talking about Black men under touched.
Yes.
Just in that nature of it, when did the king get touched? Who got to touch the king? And this is the person who's leading your culture, and in theory, setting your standards.
Yes.
So how does the king understand and normalize contact?
Yes.
And that also becomes a problem with the classic idea of divine right rule. You're not supposed to touch a god.
Yeah. That feels a lot like the embodiment of patriarchy in America today. We really carry a level of leadership, of untouchableness, untenderness. That leadership is synonymous with no emotions. My father was a pastor for all of my life, and I remember we would go to, because of the carnage of our particular community, we would go to average 3 to 6 funerals a year. My dad would preach probably 3 out of the 6. And his tradition was he would preach, and then after he would preach, he would walk down, he would stand next to the casket as the family would come up and see their loved one for the last time. And they would, just like one human should do when they see their loved one for the last time, weep and cry. And he would just stoically stand by the casket as if there wasn't a tear in his body to come through his body. And I grew up from 5 years old, early memories, looking at him. And at that time, not even taking it in. Not even, like, I didn't even know I was already embodying not feeling and not crying, or not being tender and vulnerable, but it was happening in front of me, right? And I remember probably around college, I started having some art pieces around tears and crying. I started kind of having some analysis. I was still 5, 6 years out from having my first tears in my adult years. And so I think there's a level of kings, leadership, pastors, like their ability to be complex, like tears and touch aren't far apart. Tenderness and touch are not far apart. When we're building a comprehensive touch plan for young Black men, we're not. We always ask them on the first day, "What is your touch plan?" "Oh, my girlfriend." They're done. "Oh, my partner, my wife." That's it. That's one on the list. And you ask them 6 months in, "What is your touch plan?" They go, "Well, number 1 is probably the earth. Oh, my dog, my good friend so and so who's the man, my other good friend so and so who's also so." And we have like 10 things, all the way down to number 10. "Oh yeah, and my wife too. And my partner too, and my potential partner in the future." That's there, but it's not all that on them. And that part of imbalance that is so normalized in our behavior is you're all of my touch is a part of that narrative that's inappropriate on any cultural space. But I find it very damaging when we look at folks that are Black men that are targeted by other oppressions that lock us up for being accused of being targeted as violence, that lock us up for drug addiction and other addictions that will cause them ravening through our space. We see addiction drop dramatically. We see violence drop dramatically. When someone's at touch balance, their whole ecosystem is shifted. Right? The whole ecosystem is shifted. So I sit back and I get teary-eyed and my heart opens up when I think about building I look at the United States and how many football fields in every high school, every college, every junior college, real estate. And I'm not here to dismantle that, but I would love to have a bird's eye view in 20 years, 30 years, whenever it's possible. We have same amount of resource set aside. So we have grid lines for football to hit each other and grid lines to go and cuddle and be close and build safe communities for folks to normalize being human in public. And that's not even a radical thing anymore. I dream and envision that day someday.
Very nice. So we'll just pause there and for the recording. And I just want everyone to consider what was just said here. What's your touch plan? Name the 10 different things or people that you are in constant physical contact with. Obviously, the earth is one of those. Your partner might be number 2, but where are the others? So take a moment, folks, in this break. Think about that. Ask yourself that question. And we'll be back here on Untying Knots. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Aaron Johnson. So stay tuned, folks.
Follow Voice America at facebook.com/Voice America for juicy updates from your favorite radio shows and podcasts.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Are you looking for life's answers? How about the meaning of true self? Can you really be a better person overnight? Well, good luck with that. Now, if you really want to know more about this insane world and life we lead, tune into Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. You'll learn about how the brain operates under different psychological conditions. Some common sense. Heck, you might just actually learn something. Listen Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on Voice America Empowerment.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Aaron Johnson. And we've been talking about the subject of the chronically undertouched, and especially undertouched for men, and especially men of color, especially Black men. So we ended the last segment asked with the question of, folks, what is your touch plan? So let's talk about what are some of the simple things people can do to start further building their touch plan and realizing what's missing, and then your program from there.
Really? Oh man, there's so much, and I love how practical this is. And I think the first thing is that I know that all of our nervous systems are very different, and how trauma, big and small and in between, hits on our nervous system. So I think the first thing I invite folks to do is just to kind of do an assessment. Some folks are like, if I had a choice, I would never leave my bed. I would just cuddle for hours and hours and never get out of bed. I mean, my job, if my job was cuddling, I would just do that all the time. And some folks are like, I don't need much, just like 10 minutes of cuddling, I'm good for a week. But just know where you are, know where you're try and get a sense of where you are. You might get your 10 minutes in, go, I could use 20, and so on and so forth. I've worked with a lot of young Black men that early on, they were like, I'm good, I don't need any touch. And then a week later, like, oh my God, I needed so much touch, I didn't realize, because they had given up on the idea. So the practical things we can do is, first, I would say in a simple meditative or journaling space, if you're a writer, just sit down and just go, if I had a magic wand in my life, how much touch would I prefer? Would I would say that would be balancing for me? And we're talking about whatever is nourishing touch for you. Tender touch might not be always nourishing depending on your nervous system, how it goes. So once you get that sense, I have told folks that I work with, and I have a pretty more intense schedule now, that I have folks I work with where we are virtual. I'm on the tour right now. We call each other for 3 minutes. We just say, you know what, I'm going to, and one of my favorite things to do is we just get coconut oil or shea butter and just do like an arm massage while I'm on the phone with attention with someone holding space with me, going almost like accountability partner awareness. I'm holding my hands. I'm just intentionally learning what it means to have a touch practice with my body for 3 minutes. Sometimes I just do like a chest massage. It's not like a professional. It's like just literally intuitive. Just the most important thing is I'm consciously aware of how tender I am and how important it is to be with my body, right? Practice touching my body, because it's so much easier for me to help someone touch my body if I practice it myself. And so the idea is that's 3 minutes. And most people are like, Aaron, why 3 minutes? Why not like 15? You can grow to that. But I found in a culture that has this illusion that we never have enough time for magic, to always say 3 minutes we have, right? We have that. And I found the most busiest person take 3 minutes. The other piece, and this is legitimately important, in that if you live in a large city, this might not be easy, but I think it's important to fight for touch with the earth. Now, I realize this is difficult at times, but I remember I was in San Francisco doing a workshop with children, and my nervous system was so shot because I was a whole week without touching. My hands were shaky. I was like, what's going on? I don't drink coffee. I don't do drugs. Why am I so shaky? And I remember the last exercise we did with those students that week was to do clay structures and play with clay that I bring from the desert. And I stuck my hands to get the clay kind of mixed up and moist. And I felt my whole body go like almost like I was out of water. And I had never experienced that consciously. And so I would say that if you're in a city where you get up in the morning, you might not actually naturally touch the earth. I recommend if there's any safe earth in your backyard, there's any earth you can get access to that's accessible, to go take your shoes off and sit 5 minutes. You can start with 5 minutes, your feet on the earth. And in some cases that might be difficult. And what I do is oftentimes when I travel, especially large cities, I carry a clay ball. I carry a clay ball from my property, maybe the size of like a little tangerine or a lemon. And I just put it in my bag and I just take it out. I just rub it. Sometimes I rub it on my chest, sometimes I rub it in my hand. So I just hold it. I love clay for that. And all my workshops, I hand out clay. So I would say get some clay. Now, all earth is great, but clay naturally balls itself up into a beautiful, almost meditative space. Take that clay ball, hold it 20 minutes a day. I would say that is medicine that you wouldn't even realize is a part of your world. And I'll close with one of the things we do, and this is something that is a little more extreme, but when you can, I would say make it a part of your summer or life design if you have the privilege or resource to do so, and go and spend the night in a natural building. There's super adobe, a cob house, some kind of natural building. Tents are fine because almost there, but I would prefer folks seek out natural, break the landscape of where we are and we shelter ourselves in. It is an energetic shift to make that a part of your bucket list, summer plans, to get to places where that's accessible. I know folks in Arizona and folks in like the high desert, so they have more accessibility, but there's a cob houses happening everywhere. But I would say try and get to those spaces and drop in and notice your energetic field shift. And that's what I would say.
I think some would also know them as earth ships.
Oh, yeah. Earth ships would qualify as this too. Earth ships are another powerful natural building,
which is a form of architectural practice for those wondering. Yeah. Another thought just comes to mind, especially from what we do in some of the therapy practice, is getting like some of those storage bins that you would store stuff in. It doesn't have to be a big one or deep one, and just go get a small bag of potting soil, which you can find at any hardware store or like grocery outlets and so forth, and put that in the bin and periodically put your feet in it.
Yes. That's also good too, because I know that sometimes large cities have high levels of lead in their soil because of just the traffic and the toxic of a city. And so it might be good to go get some soil from the store and get it cleaned, or it's already clean. It's good for like growing food. It's good for your feet. So that's something I've learned when I was in the Bay Area. We were going to build a super adobe structure and we had to bring soil in from outside the city that didn't have so much high content of lead in it. And I was like, what? But yeah, I'm so used to the desert where we live, where the lead content is very, very low, if non-existent at all, because it's not high population. So yeah, that's an excellent recommendation.
Well, also not just high population, a history. Let's consider lead was a additive to paint before we realized it between what I think it was we realized it in like 1950, 1960. So how many years before that were they dumping lead into the paint?
Yeah.
Let alone what we know about the gasoline too.
Yeah.
So there is a history here where the sense of that lack of forethought, which can also be said is tied to that lack of touch, poisoned so many things.
It is. It is. Ooh.
So those are some of the simple things people can do. Why don't we talk a little more about your program? So if those who are interested in finding, calling you in, or sending people to your program, what would you like them to know?
Yeah. Well, this is so, this feels really moving. Well, cutproject.org just went live maybe a couple of weeks ago. We are in two major containers. One, we are accepting folks to apply to be a part of our deep holding program, to be supported in getting their touch balance. And we also are launching our touch specialist program that's merging into what we are eventually be calling the touch activist program, because we realize it's more touch activists and touch specialists. But right now it's sitting in the container, our last cycle of our touch specialists. These are folks that want to be trained by us and our team on like how to take this into the world. And that is going to be, that section is going to be we're going to have our first in-person immersion weekend in July. I believe it's the second to last weekend in July in Montgomery, Alabama. And the reason we're going to Montgomery, Alabama is that part of that intensive weekend is going to be walking through the Legacy Museum and getting the context of lynching in America, because we're going to talk about touch and bruteness and the history. You can't get an epic center of the story of lynching, amongst other things, is the justification was the invention of the Black brute. And so touch specialists will go through that program. And we're going to have another touch specialist program where I'm at right now. I'm in Northern California. We're going to have an immersion, and this is going to be centered around African heritage folks specifically. This is going to be a Black touch specialist program, and we're going to have an immersion program here on the land. It's 189 acres off grid. Land that is part of its commitment here is to support reclaiming the touch program. And then in that, you'll see that on the website, is we're making a documentary. We're making a documentary. If folks that apply will have an option to be a part of the documentary, as we want to document a group of Black men and other Black-bodied folks, but Black men is that's one of the hardest ones to find, that are going to go through a year cycle of being chronically under touched to their touch balance, and how their life and shifts, what obstacles come up for them. And so those are ways that will all be kind of found there on the Cut Project website.org. You can find that at our cut.project on Instagram. We'll be updating those ideas, but that's the best way to find us. And we'll be excited to be graduating our second class of touch specialists, and also inviting our first class of deep holders or be held in their container. So that's where we are right now, and I'm really moved. This property here is still in this process of being anointed with its first class of touch specialists. But I'm so glad to have a space, and hope to have more spaces in the United States. This is a football field to talk about. This is the first one, 180 acres here in Northern California, and we want that immersed, deep nature experience here, and we hope to continue to build on that.
Very nice, and very wants to build further forward. So let's go on to one of my, sort of closing questions, which is talking about the myths and realities of mental health. And as the sort of our conversation is brought up, how has there been oppression around our mental health? And let's, if we can, tie it back into this sense of touch as well.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the missing pieces in our modern day therapy is touch, right? You can't touch your clients. I mean, this is not something that's licensed to do for a variety of reasons, from legalities and everything else. But there's a question I ask a lot of folks, therapists included, is like, what was missing from therapy in the whole world for a long time was Black people. So talking to you as a professional that has fought your way through all the obstacles to become a therapist is tremendously, wasn't even accessible to me. Even 10 years ago, I couldn't find a therapist near me, and we weren't doing a lot of virtual back then. And so for me, I think what has been missing was Black folks. But now that is changing. I feel like there's no, when I use the analogy of I'm lost in the forest for 4 weeks, I'm starving, and then finally the rescue team finds me and they take me to the hospital. The hospital doesn't go, "Oh my goodness, Aaron, you were starving for 4 weeks. You haven't eaten a full meal. There's a buffet nearby. Let's take you over there and eat all you want." I probably could die from that kind of intake of food after not having food. There's an actual medical protocol. I don't know it, but I know it exists. Where the doctors would hydrate me and bring me slowly back into nutrition balance. There's a medical protocol. But if I show up and I'm chronically undertouched as a Black male body to any kind of therapeutic space, I am chronically undertouched. I've been touched in 12 years. I'm undertouched. We don't actually have a comprehensive model or multiple options that will help different mental health crises we don't have a clear protocol. No problem, sir. Come right in here. We have a touch special program right down the hallway here. We don't have it accessible. Folks that have really studied the complexity around the Black male body, we'll use that as examples, one that's the most untouchable right now, into the professional field of like, how do we bring you from that gradient into that space to now you can now have a cuddle plan, a comfortable touch plan, an earth touch plan that now you can take into the world without being ridiculed and attacked for it. And a lot of young Black men that come out of our program, we say, you don't want to go in. So I think that's missing, that protocol. And I say multiple protocols, because we need like 50 probably, but even one is not readily available.
Which I think brings up an interesting aspect in our field. And I say this with full respect to my other therapists. Our field is very much female dominated.
Yeah.
And then we've also got the issues of how are our female therapists, one, comfortable with dealing with such things as anger, because anger can be the surface candy on the sadness.
Oh, yeah.
But also is given the stats have given on women who have been sexually assaulted, how many of them are also dealing with struggles of what it means to be dealing with a male client. And let's be frank, there's male clients who will not go to a woman therapist. So that training for them, for our female fellow therapists, understand that touch component and how it is not normalized in their society, dealing with their own biases around that is something to be brought attention to. And equally, how does that not support the idea of more like myself, men coming into this field to continue to help with that, and reminding that there is a desire for them to have men that can do that. So why are you giving fault to those of us who are attempting to actually live and embody that quality?
There's so much. And I have a lot of women, white women, particularly therapists in my organization in holistic resistance and abroad, that have come to the work as anti-racist activists and have heard about my touch specialists and touch activist program, and were like blown away and how much it differs from cuddlers. And I'm here in the Northwest. I was in the Northwest for the last month and a half, and I don't know if it's like the Epic Center, but it feels like all the professional cuddlers were either born, worked, or has been practiced and trained there in the Northwest. And I know there are other places of the country that people do special cuddling, but there's this kind of rogue, evolving culture of professional cuddlers, and oftentimes they're also white women or not non-binary queer folks. And I will say that Black men are oftentimes held the most unskillfully in those environments. And so working with them, and a lot of these consent trainers also use their consent trainers, sex educators and cuddlers have no lens on lynching, have no lens on the Black brute, and it's terrifying to have them walk into a space and have no sense of that lineage and history. And so I think there's a lot of gaps we need to close in just like historical history of like, a lot of the cuddlers have not gazed at a picture of a lynched Black body on a tree. As a white-bodied person in the United States, that's an important kind of history that's missing, I think, in their analysis. Even I think a lot of white therapists have not spent enough time with that image or at all. And I think that's also a part of the gap.
Or even just the nature of how sexual assault was used in slavery. I mean, there is the classic stories about the woman being assaulted by the slave owner, but how many men were assaulted by the slave owner?
Yes.
Both male and by female slave owners.
Yes.
So there's also an entire branch of that sexual assault history that is on both sides, on all elements of our culture, that is also needing to be understood for what you're talking about. And you and I had a previous planning conversation. We discussed this, but just consider the history of the buck breaking farm.
Yes.
That's something for those of you who are interested, go look at the histories of that.
Yes.
Not to mention also the histories around breeding farms.
Yes.
So those are also parts of the, shall we say, sexual touch damage that needs to be healed and that is still carried in epigenetically to this day as well as part of our generational trauma.
100%. That is an hour that I would love to spend unpacking both of those two topics. But in short, I'll just say I'm deeply moved when we talk about what's missing. I would say that history, especially if you're going to talk about touch. And you're going to talk about, that's why we're going to Montgomery, Alabama for our touch specialist program. We're not going to Hawaii. We're not going to a nice resort we're going to Montgomery, which is an amazing place, but we're going to Montgomery, talk about touch. And people are confused at first. Like, why are you going to Legacy Museum? Why are you going? Now, mind you, everyone should go to Legacy Museum. But for us, our cohort really needs to make sure we're tracking what it means to show up with some sense of the actual history of the United States, how it attains to the sexual trauma stories that are untracked, unnoticed, under-therapied in Black male bodies and Black bodies in America. And we're getting better, but I think this part around touch, and we should talk about looking that up. I hope that there's some major films that have some deep analysis of these topics that skillfully track the evolution and the erasure of this topic. So I feel like that's huge. And I was saying in conclusion, when I work with touch with young Black men, homophobia, transphobia, it comes up so fast. It comes up so fast. And so I think for me, this is something I navigate on a daily basis. One of the biggest hurts that I have to wrestle with, of really, really honing in on what does it mean to disrupt the homophobia that's in our bodies that comes to that buck-breaking farm in our Black male bodies that doesn't sit in white male bodies the same way in the United States. So there's a way we're ostracized without even being slowed down and analyzed. We should definitely heal from that, but our healing might be different because history is different. So that's something I want to make sure that we make sure we speak to here and promise to come back and do our good work at spreading this knowledge into the world. So there's not just a couple of brothers talking about it here, but it becomes a more of a national conversation.
So all I can say, so what I would probably say at this to end our conversation is oppression is the one who's saying, is this your king? Is this your king? And that's not the voice of Killmonger. That's the voice of oppression. So where can folks find you if they want to start asking more and getting involved with your helping and supporting your program?
Yeah, cutproject.org, holisticresistance.com. Easy ways to grab me. Just send me an email. Love to hear from you all.
Perfect. Those will be in the show notes, folks. So think about this. Think about what your touch plan is. Thinking about what more of history can you learn so that we can heal. So this has been Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Aaron Johnson. So be well. May the ancestors help you heal, and go forth.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.